So good afternoon. This is Marguerite Newhammer from the Office of Inclusive Excellence. Thank you for joining us for the Fire Next Time, Anti-Black Racism and the Struggle to Live in the United States. As you can see from our overview, we are really privileged to have with us several speakers from the campus and our moderator, Douglas Haynes. Before moving into the program, let me just outline for you that your audio has been muted. However, we really encourage you to use the Q&A function to provide us with any questions to the panelists or to me. And the forum is recorded, so participants will be able to access that recording when it's made available at the OIE website. So without further ado, let me introduce our Vice Chancellor, Douglas Haynes.
Thank you so much for joining us. On behalf of the UC Office of Inclusive Excellence, I want to thank you for taking time and joining us for a conversation about anti-Black racism and the struggle to live in the United States. I want to use this moment to thank members of the Black community for their presence, sacrifice, and will to live and love, despite conditions that seek to negate our very existence. I too want to acknowledge the various people from different backgrounds who, in a variety of ways, have expressed their solidarity with the Black community. It is my deep hope that this demonstration of solidarity will only deepen and grow. There can only be real lasting change by understanding the structures and mechanisms that devalue Black people, and then to act to confront, interrupt, and dismantle them. They still exist. The title of this program this afternoon, The Fire Next Time, refers to a powerful set of essays by James Baldwin, published in 1963. It is telling that the first essay is written in the form of a letter to his nephew on the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation, the beginning of the end of chattel slavery in the United States, but not anti-Blackness. In this essay, Baldwin transmits the knowledge and experience of a Black gay man about the centrality of race in a society organized around white supremacy to a young Black man who will have to negotiate a hostile landscape for the rest of his natural life. The reckoning that the country currently is experiencing brings us together today. But I think it is important to acknowledge that many people have been using their voices and bodies to resist and challenge anti-Black racism in this country for centuries. The ongoing demonstrations in support of Black lives and the protests against the murder of Black men and women and transgender and queer people is undeniable. But the question looming before us is, what next? What after the smoke clears? How will we all confront anti-Blackness while becoming authentic allies of the Black community? Prompting this question is the fact that this is not the first time that a Black person was murdered in police custody, or for that matter, at the hands of vigilantes. This is not the first time that people have taken to the streets. Recall there was uprisings in Watts in 1965, followed by uprisings in the wake of the execution of Martin Luther King in 1968, and the brutal assault on Rodney King in 1992. There were and are others that go unnoticed or are erased from the record or from public consciousness altogether. Driving the creation of this panel is the desire to share knowledge and promote understanding about the conditions and possibilities for Black life in this country. The format consists of questions that I will ask each of the panelists, and afterward, the floor will be open to your questions, We have already curated questions that you've provided during registration, and we encourage others through the live chat box. So for now, let's get to it. I'm deeply honored to introduce our panelists, who are professors here at UC Irvine. They will bring to bear their expertise to outline the contours of the struggle to live in the United States for Black people. They are Professor of Sociology, Dr. Sabrina Strings, Professor of Pediatrics, Dr. Candice Taylor, Professor of Sociology, Belinda Robnett, Chair and Professor of African American Studies, Dr. Frank Wilderson. Unfortunately, Dr. and Dean of the Law School, Song Richardson, will be unable to join us. We hope to collaborate with the School of Law on a future program. First, I want to turn to Professor Springs, who recently published a book, Fearing the Black Body, The Racial Origins of Fat Phobia. But you also published an opinion piece in the New York Times where you discuss several relationships between the health of African Americans. To what extent are you identifying relationships between the current pandemic of COVID and healthcare access for African Americans?
Thank you so much for that question, Doug, and also for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm frequently asked about health outcomes for African Americans, and typically people will ask me about a particular illness. So people might ask, why do Black people have such high rates of hypertension? Why do Black people have high rates of diabetes? Why do Black people have high rates of certain cancers? Or, as I was asked at that meeting that I alluded to in the piece, why are Black people so sick? And my response to that is that Black people are sick because America is sick. We are living in the afterlife of slavery. And this has ramifications for us all, but it has particular ramifications for the health and safety of Black people. So what I'm trying to underscore is that during the era of slavery, white Americans determined that Black Americans only needed the basic necessities to sustain bare life, not to be maximally healthy, not to be optimally healthy. So this meant the basic necessities in terms of food, in terms of water. Sometimes this included limited access to various nutritious offerings. Definitely it included limited access to healthcare. So there are so many different aspects of this problem that started in slavery, continued through Jim Crow, and there was no moment in the United States in which Americans decided it was important to offer universal healthcare to Black Americans, or to offer safe and healthy foods, drinking water, clean air to all Americans, much less Black Americans. Right. And so we're dealing with the ramifications of slavery. Black people have a high disease burden because we have been treated as property, as commodities, and I'm sure that Professor Wilderson will speak to us being treated as things within the United States.
Professor Strings, I want to thank you for that overview. And I want to invite Dr. Lucas to weigh in here, drawing on your experience as a professor of pediatrics and a pediatrician. My question has to do to probe the relationship between health outcomes and status of being Black, particularly as it applies to young people or children.
Thank you, Dr. Haynes, for that. And I am just grounded in what Professor Strings just said and honored to be a part of this panel, to simply be. And so thank you and everyone that's here, because we're going through such a painful time, but it's particularly painful for us as Black people. And before answering that and explaining that I am a Black woman, I am a Black mother, I want to share something that was written by a group called McStuffin Mommies, if I can, just to help with appreciating the pain that I'm navigating as I'm trying to be someone who's speaking, if you'll allow me that time.
Cool.
So this was written by Dr. Donna Adams Pickett, and she's in OB-GYN. I have not met her. This was shared on a broader listserv that focuses on health equity. And she said, "We are McStuffin Mommies. We are a collective of nearly 1,200 women physicians of color. We are nearly 1,200 women physicians of color who are also mothers. Daily, we leave our homes and tend to minds, bodies, and souls to heal them and make them better, regardless of color. With a smile, we perform physicals on toe-headed boys who look like Dylan Roof, then come home and wince in fear when our sweet little boys smile with that small gap in the front like Ahmaud Arbery. Cheerfully, we set the broken bones of men with a sprinkling of gray hair like Derek Chauvin, then anxiously hold our breaths when our husbands stand tall in dapper black suits and leave our homes like George Floyd. We hold the hands and deliver the babies of precious young women like Amy Cooper, then admonish our sons to never leave the house alone and always have a witness when speaking to strange women who do not look like us, their sisters or their grandmothers. Anxiously, we teach our curly-haired boys that if those women raise an alarm to keep their hands up, eyes down, and voices low, when speaking to those they may summon. With determined efficiency, we restart the hearts of red-haired men like Travis McMichael, then feel our stomach twist in knots when our daughters complete their applications for EMT training like Breonna Taylor. We remain committed to our oath, to provide the best medical care possible to every patient that crosses our paths, regardless of their station in life, their religious affiliation, their color. We do this while we look at our beautiful brown children with the crushing reality that this world will never afford them that same level of equanimity and grace.
Wow. Wow.
For 8 minutes and 46 seconds, we saw, but most of all, we heard 114 words, two that pierced our souls, two cries for mama. We heard our boys, we heard our girls, we heard in that moment that no matter how many lives we save, there are so many others willing to take the lives we made. We made a promise to, or make a promise to us, America. We made a promise to care for your children. Make a promise to us to do better by our children and allow us to breathe. And I have apologized for my tears, and I'm not apologizing anymore.
Please don't. Please don't.
Because I have the privilege of crying, and there are people who don't. So in thinking about and navigating the role that I have in Lead ABC, I see it as one in a place of gratitude and being able to not just sit here by myself, but sit beside my co-director, Dr. Carol Major, who's the fourth maternal fetal medicine physician, fourth Black female maternal fetal medicine physician in this. And I recognize that in this position, I stand beside the students and am helping them and allowing them to be seen, and I'm so proud of them. And I step into this reality that as a pediatrician, I'm caring for children and trying to help parents who have to break racism. Racism is firmly placed within the minds of children. They have biases by the age of 5. And as a pediatrician, as a physician, I have to step into that and know that I have a role that goes beyond just now, and to speak to the fact that slavery is disease, and it's the reason for, and just to lean on what Professor Strings said, it's freeing to hear that said, because it allows me to say, yes, this is a fact, and we have to pay attention. And for children who are separated because of the pandemic from their parents who are frontline workers, from doctors, from grocery store workers, from individuals that are putting themselves out there, when I'm thinking about the weight of disparity and the weight of what is facing us, not just in Orange County, but broadly within our nation and even beyond that, it's firmly rooted in the fact that our nation's roots are, they're not fertile. And that's what I think of when I come into the place of who do I need to be as a physician? And I put my mask on and I care for each patient individually. And I try to be the role model so that students who are not in medical school know that it's possible for them to be there, and advocate along allies to make sure that LEAD ABC exists so that we can have the power to make change, because this is not something we can check box off in our School of Medicine. And I am so thankful to be on this panel, to be able to lean on each of you, to learn from each of you in this moment, and to help bring that to the School of Medicine so we can actually continue this journey in promoting health for Black people. And I believe you're still muted.
Muted myself. What's striking to me from the comments by Professor Strings and Professor Lucas is how, as a condition of existence, Black people have to reconcile these powerful contradictions of both giving life, but also preserving life of those who do not have our interests at heart. And I want to turn to now Professor Wilderson, who just recently published an important book entitled Afro-pessimism, to sort of explore the sort of larger foundation of anti-Blackness in America that can be expressed in various forms of contradictions, where we're both living and dying at the same time, saving people who aren't interested in saving us.
Thank you, Doug. And before I get started, I just want to thank Professor Lucas for her intervention. And as I don't know you, we're meeting for the first time virtually. It's really, really heartening to hear that message from someone in the hard sciences, I must say. And I know Belinda and Sabrina well enough to use first names. I would like you to call me Frank. Could I call you Candice throughout this?
Please do.
Okay, thank you. So what you said has really affected me, because I had something all planned. And now I'm going to try and get through it. I don't know if I can. So thank you, and I'm sorry. Doug, I want to say something as a way of a preamble, that I am very happy every time you do something like this. I'm just gonna, I've been here 15 years in July, and I consider myself to be in this place, but not of it. I think that the vertical integration of anti-Black violence is not out there in the streets. It's vertically integrated into the carceral, imprisoned reality of our lives as professors, the carceral, imprisoned reality of Black graduate students, the carceral, imprisoned reality of Black staff people, the carceral, imprisoned reality of undergraduates who are really on the front line of microaggressions every single day here. And so I'm just going to be honest. I know we're speaking to the whole university community, and I don't give a damn. I'm going to be honest because what I think your efforts, Doug, are necessary. I would prefer to have these kinds of dialogues intramural with Black people only, so I didn't have to have in this one side of my brain, how am I communicating and what am I communicating to the larger UCI community, because that's my job as an inmate in this prison. And I would prefer to talk to other inmates without having to account for how the wardens and meaning your colleagues in administration, Doug, and the other guards are going to hear me out. So I think that these are necessary conversations, and there's also something very obscene about them. And the obscenity is that every time something like this happens, I know you remember this, but when Trayvon Martin was killed, key professors were rolled out again to have some kind of public display of explaining to the community as though it is possible to teach the libidinal economy. In other words, as though it is possible to teach the collective unconscious of this country, and I do not believe that it is. But something always happens in these things, which I'm going to try to resist in my own participation today, and that is a potpourri of non-Black people coming to the vocal space of these things to allow themselves or to hijack a discussion of anti-Black violence for what I've called in my writing the ruse of analogy, so that they can begin to use our pain and our platforms to talk about the ways in which they suffer. And I'm not having that today. That I said, thank you, Sabrina. I mean, I hate the fact that I feel teary right now. I was so in tears in that panel because what I could hear, and that was before COVID. Thankfully, I don't have to see all these people in the audience, right? But what happened with the actual bodies in that audience was that every time somebody raised a hand, they brought up an issue that had nothing to do with Trayvon, that was so related to white women's oppression, Latinos, anti-immigration laws. And I saw a large scrum of undergraduate Black students get quieter and quieter and quieter and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until the whole room took over. And the last thing I said before I was crying to the point where I couldn't talk anymore was that, see what's happening here? Do you see what's happening here? They will use you, speaking to the Black students, to mobilize their concerns, and you will become refugees in their political projects, even after the murder of someone like Trayvon Martin. So now that I've said that preamble and got that off my chest so I can regain my composure and act like the milquetoast Negro I act like when I'm teaching, let me answer your question. I think it's time to stop being alarmed and dismayed at moving images of yet another Black person being gunned down or killed with their knee in the neck for what we know to be a common crime, which is breathing while Black. Perhaps the crime is even more elemental than breathing. What if the way the capital offense reads in the statutes is simply being while Black? A capital crime for which any white or non-Black person is deputized to adjudicate and punish. Or in the precise language of Afro-pessimism, the person could be of any race because, as we know, Latinx man murdered Trayvon Martin. In other words, we live as Black people in a crime and punishment paradigm in which everyone Black is a criminal and every non-Black person is a member of a posse in waiting. This is the claim of Afro-pessimism, a claim that asserts itself without recourse to the performativity of guilt and innocence that is normally played out when Blackness is not the target of a dilemma. Anti-Black violence is par excellence the democratization of crime and punishment. Let me repeat that. Anti-Black violence is par excellence the democratization of crime and punishment. A violence that instantiates a world in which all Black people bear the birthmark of a perk, and all people who are not Black are enforcers of the law, whether or not they don badges, brandish guns, troll the streets looking for runaway slaves, or are rightly nauseated by their own inheritance. It doesn't matter what they think of this inheritance, that is their inheritance structurally. So 10 years ago, the philosopher and Afro-pessimist theorist David Marriott argued that lynching should not be seen as aberrant acts of racist violence to be stamped out by better laws and the commitment of their enforcement. Rather, lynching should be understood as bacchanals of enjoyment and rituals for community building. Through the image of dead Blacks hanging from trees, he argued, people who are not Black are able to fashion selfhood. Readers of his work need to understand the difference between the way the mind's unconscious fashions identity and the way the conscious mind fashions identity. A deep hermeneutic plunge into structural violence and psychoanalysis, something I cannot rehearse here. But where the argument lands, the claims are easily translated. Simply put, lynching photographs, and now I've extended this argument in my own books to modern video recordings on iPhones. All of these things contribute more to producing stability, more to producing and stabilizing the identities of people who are not Black than they contribute to exposing and preventing the horror of these rituals. Whereas the conscious mind is saying when they look at these films, what horror, this needs to end. The unconscious mind is breathing both a sigh of relief and the joy of recognition. That is to say, I exist as a human because were I to experience the mutilation of the body that this moving image or this photograph or this film has recorded, there would have to be a reason. Being while white, being while brown, being while red, being while yellow, none of these are capital offenses. And as we go on, I can elaborate more, Doug, but I'll end there to give more time to others.
Thank you, Frank. I appreciate the preamble. And as always, I'm always available for conversation and convening people. I think what's so powerful about Afro-pessimism is that it highlights the internal logics of the United States in particular, but it has applications in other parts of the world. And for that reason, I'm particularly interested in inviting Professor Robnett to comment on social movements for change. Your work examines protests and civil rights movements and highlight the different perspectives and agents involved. To what extent is a protest a part of a US tradition, and how is it being used in the current moment to identify issues important to African Americans?
All right, thank you for that question, but I want to say I've been incredibly moved by the others who have spoken here today as well, Candice and Sabrina and Frank. So my comments I will make with humility here because this is your viewpoints are just it's just emotionally moving for me, and probably because I genuinely have not really stopped crying since I saw the George Floyd video. I'm gonna try to keep it together here. And so, Doug, I'm gonna somewhat answer your question, but I'm gonna deviate a little bit. Because I kind of want to contextualize where we are today. So I'll start a little bit about myself, because myself is involved in why I do the work I do. I was born in South Central Los Angeles during Jim Crow, so I'm one of the old ones. Every single man in my family was either arrested or harassed by the police. By the grace of God, my brother is not dead. One day coming home from work, he was swooped upon by a posse of police officers in Colorado. They surrounded his vehicle with megaphones. They told him to get out of the car. He was face down on the ground, and they had their weapons trained on him. And Fortunately, out of all of those police officers, there was one African-American police officer who said, it's not him. It's not him. And they said, are you sure? And he says, no, he doesn't look like him. It's not him. So I'm not sure what the criminal they thought they were chasing, but my brother could have easily been dead today with one small false move. And so that is the country I grew up in. I have lived through the civil rights movement and the protests, the Black Power movement, the Watts riots, and the 1992 LA riots. Those over the injustice in the Rodney King beating where police officers were acquitted. So none of what is happening today, sadly, is new. Since the advent of slavery, as Professor Strings pointed out, Black Americans have been murdered, shackled, and imprisoned. And so before all of the list of names of recent people that we know about, there have been thousands of Black Americans who have been murdered at the hands of the police or slaveholders or others who see themselves empowered to kill Black people. So just to kind of really honor those, I know it's a little bit of a list, and it surely isn't complete, but I want us to keep this at the center of our conversation today. And so we know that George Floyd was killed by police, Freddie Gray, Sam Du Bois, Philandro Castile, Terrence Crutcher, Alton Sterling, Jamar Clark, Jeremy McDowell, William Chapman II, Walter Scott, Eric Harris, Tamir Rice, Ahmaud Arbery, Akai Gurley, Michael Brown, Eric Gardner, Breonna Taylor, Delron Small, Sandra Bland, Azeel Ford, Michelle Cassell, Tanisha Anderson, Natasha McKenna, Betty Jones, Botham Jean, Tatiana Jefferson, Eric Pearson, Dominique Clayton. And so these are just a few. Black Americans are 2.5 times as likely as white Americans to be killed by police officers. And so with that, what has happened since the early 1990s, oh, actually the 1970s, from the peak of the civil rights movement. And I'm just going to read you a few excerpts from the book, only because I want you to think about the ways in which you're hearing about what's going on today, and really ponder the extent to which this discourse appreciably differs. And so in 1991, national attention was drawn to the persistence of institutionalized racism in both the legal and criminal justice system by the videotape beating of Rodney Glenn King by 4 Los Angeles Police Department officers. And I won't go into all the details. At the time, Benjamin Hooks was president of the NAACP and Joseph Lowry of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and they issued statements condemning the actions. Executive Director Hooks stated, "It has been rare in our experience that so much anger, shock, and revulsion as conveyed to us by private citizens as has occurred as a result of the senseless and brutal beating of Rodney Glenn King by police in the Los Angeles area. The phones in our headquarters in Baltimore, our Washington bureau, our Los Angeles bureau, and our regional office in that city have been kept busy by callers, some of them actually in tears, who deplored this disgraceful incident and asked how it could happen in a civilized country. Viewed over national television, the videotape shot by a concerned citizen seems to clearly show that Mr. King was struck repeatedly by police officers as he lay helpless on the ground. Reverend Lowery condemned the police brutality, stating, "This is simply another in a long and sad series of brutality cases against the LA Police Department. The officers who committed the savage beating should be dismissed from the force and face criminal prosecution." And the chief is obviously unable to bring, an end to numerous incidents of violence by police officers and should vacate the office. On March 21st, President Bush, at the time, the elder one, while steering clear of calling for the resignation of LA Police Chief Gates, publicly denounced the actions of the white police officers and stated that, quote, "The videotapes and transcripts were, quote unquote, shocking. Quote, "It was sickening to see the beating that was rendered, and there's no way in my view to explain that away. It was outrageous," unquote. So there, Bush also began to frame this as an anomaly and indicated a strong support for honest police officers who obey the law. The NAACP announced a series of public hearings on police conduct that went through many major cities. Okay. And on April the 29th, all 4 of those police officers accused of the beating were acquitted. There was shock, disbelief, and of course, the riots ensued, much like those today. Similarly, just like those today, there is this sense in the media and beyond that the peaceful protests are very different than the looting and the violent people who are not really adhering to or concerned about what has taken place. And so if you'll bear with me just a little bit longer, I'm going to read you a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King about the riots. And he said, "Certain conditions continue to exist in our society, which must be condemned as vigorously as we condemn riots. But in the final analysis, a riot is the language of the unheard." So I'm going to say that again. A riot is the language of the unheard. And what is it that America has failed to hear? It has failed to hear that the plight of the Negro poor has worsened over the last few years. It has failed to hear that the promises of freedom and justice have not been met. And it has failed to hear that large segments of white society are more concerned about tranquility and the status quo than about justice, equality, and humanity. And so in a real sense, our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay. And as long as America postpones justice, we stand in the position of having these recurrences of violence and riots over and over again. Social justice and progress are the absolute guarantors of riot prevention. And so that's a quote from Martin Luther King. And as my book on African-American women's role in the civil rights, the title is How Long, How Long? And so I'll end there, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about what works with protest as we come to that.
Thank you, Belinda, I appreciate it. I think all 4 of the panelists have offered powerful perspectives on this particular moment. And each of them have identified that this particular moment is part of a larger web, a larger fabric of injustice and inequality. And it does pose the question, what next? That question looms quite large now as many Americans are reacting to the film execution of George Floyd. And as Professor Robnett mentioned, we've seen this before. And so I guess the question that I want to pose to the panelists, which comes from some of our audience members, is what next? Do we simply exercise the type of stilted response that we've seen in the past that doesn't guarantee change but inaction? Do we sit in this longer? What do we do? And I want to invite the panelists to weigh in on that. Professor Strings, would you like to?
Yes, but before I do, I just want to thank the other panelists. It was just so moving to hear what people said. I mean, from the letter that Candice read to, the many different quotes from MLK and former President Bush. And I don't even know where to begin talking about Frank's comments. I was just thinking, I'm a professor here, but maybe I'll start taking his classes. But I think that I want to build on something that Belinda said at the end, part of the MLK quote about tranquility in the status quo. And I feel like the questions about what next are really just moves toward this kind of effort to return to the status quo. Mm-hmm. It's probably because of the fact that we're in a pandemic right now that there's so much attention on these recent murders. Even as Belinda said the names of so many people that we've heard before over the past 2 decades, many of whom it's like, oh yeah, right, that one. Oh yeah, that one and that one. There were so many that I couldn't even believe it. And I'm sure that Belinda would have, that's not even a comprehensive list. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think that we have the tools at this time to start thinking about how to stop it, how to fix it, right? All of these sort of quick fixes are just sort of moves toward trying to feign that anti-Blackness is not endemic, mm-hmm. and that it is arguably intractable. Mm-hmm. And it's the kind of thing that if we really want to fix, we need to think about changing the structures and the institutions of America entirely. Mm-hmm. All of the other efforts that people might make are the kind of petty reforms that will comfort the comfortable. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Other comments, colleagues?
Yeah, I appreciate you speaking to the statement of comfort, the comfortable, and value the fact that even in this moment when we're speaking to a broad audience, right now we're all owning our Blackness mm-hmm. and able to stand in that, and it feels great. And I just want to pause and say that. As far as into what next, there's a few thoughts come to mind, and I'm going to kind of start with this thought that just kind of began. A lot of the time we try to have pillars that we build on, and we build these pillars, and then we have these solutions, and we're going to go to these pillars and seek the answers. Mm-hmm. And we do that in isolation. Mm-hmm. We try to solve things within our own box without thinking about the fact that the communities that are facing these issues, they don't need someone to come and solve their problem. Mm-hmm. And even when I think about allies, like right now, we need allies to listen. Mm-hmm. And as an institution, I think we have to stop thinking about pillars and start thinking about gears, like gears that need to be oiled, mm-hmm. that need time and attention, and that over time might not work as well, and you need to give them more oil. Mm-hmm. And I think we have to shift our focus and consider the fact that it's not just one lane, and this isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. And thinking about that, and thinking about the theory that I know each of you are scholars in, I still want to share something that influences my lens when I think about race, and when I talk to medical students about diversity and constructs around racism. Dr. Kamara Jones is an amazing just person and scholar, and she was a Association of Public Health president, and she uses a gardener's tale. And in the gardener's tale, she shows 2 pots, and they each have flowers. And I'll use the colors, we'll say one is pink and the other is yellow. So the yellow pot looks at its petals and it thinks, gosh, I don't like my petals. I wish I did not have yellow petals. And I don't want you bee that are trying to come here and give me pollen to make me yellow. And that's internalized racism. And we have to think about how, as an institution, we can break the media messages that are coming to our students that make them have doubt about themselves and question who they are within this institution that tries to define their role and their ability to get into the institution based on legislation that exists in our nation. Then there's the other layer of the gardener. The gardener looks at the yellow flower and he looks at the pink flower. And for whatever reason, he waters the pink flower more. He may do that intentionally, he may not do that intentionally, but there's implicit and explicit actions that are influencing the growth of that pink flower so it can thrive and be confident in itself as that pink flower. Then there's the pot. The pot of the yellow flower is cracked. Its dirt is not rich. The pot of the pink flower is perfectly molded and the dirt is rich and it's an environment in which it can thrive. And we have to not think of racism as one thing. That's the institutionalized, the structural racism that exists, and we have to attack it on all fronts. And I think we have to think about that, think about this in these layers as we're really trying to oil the gears and make change happen with an awareness of the fact it's not a destination.
You know, I want to pose a question that comes from the curated questions. And it has to do with how we organize the gears. It seems to me that I think what is not in dispute is that as a population, African Americans have been subjected to an ongoing form of trauma for which we have to reconcile in light of the various national myths. No institution is organized around being trauma informed. To what extent is that conceptual framework a worthwhile framework to organize activities and actions and interventions where we are today?
Anyone or?
Anyone?
Well, I was deeply moved by what Sabrina and Candice had to say, and so I want to kind of segue from what they were saying with an echo and then an extension into your question. But I want to get that. I want you to know, because you've helped me so much since I came here as an assistant professor. So I really want to go back to my original comments to talk about how grateful I am for all of your work, so that the claim of the meta interpretation of what we're doing as being obscene was not a reflection on you.
Of course.
And your efforts. I want that on the historical record so that we understand that, you know? But I want to say more about that, because this is precisely what, you know, I mean, I don't think anyone in their right mind would say in 1939 or 1933 to 4 Jewish intellectuals, let's set up a panel to figure out how we can come together in Nazi Germany and fix this country. I mean, that's not the panel that you have, but that's the imperative that comes to us every time. You know, in other words, that's part of the incarceration that we exist in as academics. You know, we are forced to die metaphorically as professors by having our work undervalued. There's not a Black professor on this campus that I've spoken to who doesn't have a horrific episode or more of anti-Black racism in their department. It's the reason I had to leave the art school over across the bridge and come over to African American studies. So everyone has their stories. Okay, it's obscene that we are called upon to meditate on the reform of a project called the United States of America that has no right to exist ethically to begin with. Jews will not have to deal with that. Hey, people, we know it's a little hard for you in Berlin right now with Hitler, with Hitler in the groove, right? So why don't we go over to Paris or London and have a little conference about how we could reform Nazi Germany? No, the thing was to destroy that thing, renounce everything up to that point, and then try to start over again, okay? And so what they need, meaning non-Black people, and what we need cannot be reconciled. What we need is our cognitive maps that address the singularity of the structure of our suffering. Cognitive maps that address the fact that the violence from that everyone walking around us who's not Black is deputized as a cop. The cops are not in the police station only. They're your next door neighbors. They're the people in University Hills. They're anyone. There's Karen in Central Park. She's as much a cop as the people who were in blue and killed George Floyd. Okay, so once we can talk to ourselves to elaborate a cognitive map of our suffering that does not have to articulate or be responsive to the emotional needs of other Americans, then we can begin to move forward on our own terms. And one of the things that we might do is to resist the language of nonviolence as an imperative to how we think about struggle. I am very proud to, which is the constant hydraulics of our encounters. We have to say, we live in a soup of violence. We live in a context in which we can die without transgressing any laws at any moment by the words catalyzed by anybody. And yet, we don't want to have to be shackled to making that suffering analogous to other people of color or to the white working class. And the next thing is, we do not want to have to be shackled into raising a conversation of political tactics to the level of moral principles. Okay, so what I mean, I'm going to just make this point really quickly and then shut up. What I mean by that is that the burning of a police station is a tactic. Writing an op-ed piece to the New York Times is a tactic. They're both equally legitimate. Why? Because we say so. That's why they're equally legitimate. And I refuse to be imposed upon by someone else who wants to talk to me about the destruction of violence, who wants to talk to me about retaliatory violence against the police. Because if I go into that ensemble of questions, if I go into that kind of structure of feeling, then what I have done without even knowing it, is I have denounced the legacy of Harriet Tubman. I have denounced the legacy of Nat Turner. I have denounced the legacy of Assata Shakur and the Black Liberation Army, who took it to the people who ran these structures. That's number one. But the worst thing about this is that I have allowed the general civil society of white and non-Black people to force me into a conversation about morality when no non-Black person has the right to make any type of moral judgment on the actions of any Black person. We are outside the law as subjects of jurisprudence, and we're outside the law as human beings. And so to quote two people, for example, Bertolt Brecht, the great communist dramaturg and playwright, wrote, "There's no crime in robbing a bank. The only crime is in starting one." And then to move even forward to my mentor, Saidiya Hartman, who wrote in an interview that I did with her, in the criminal code, which means reading the laws, in the criminal code, I read the text of Black agency. So those are two anecdotes that should animate our development internally of a cognitive map and move us out of a moral economy of guilt and innocence. We don't refuse the judgment of the court, right, or the thing of guilt and innocence. We refuse the structures itself, and then move us into an economy of ethical assessment. When you move out of an economy of moral judgment, you're moving out of the question of individual guilt and innocence, and you're moving into the questions of structural power. And when you move into this question of structural power, you cannot return, unless you're just blind, to an assessment of the American project and call it ethical on any level. Once you start talking about ethics, it has no ethical value and no ethical reason for its existence. It exists because it has 3 million people in uniform, 150,000 more people under Clinton in the streets as police, and the nuclear bomb. That's power and violence, not ethics.
Frank, thank you. Thank you for that compelling intervention. We now are close to our appointed hour where we bring this program to a close. I do hope the conversation continues. The Office of Inclusive Excellence will be hosting a self-care and community program at 4 p.m. But before we close out, I first want to thank our panelists for their remarkable insight, their hardened commitment, and their obstinate desire to live in America. I want to ask one final question, and it's from Asani Mayers. And she writes, I'm a 26-year-old Black staff member. Can the panel provide insight or suggestions to bridge the generational gap to better organize and mobilize? I noticed that older generations get info from different sources. Like Mrs. Robnett has said, older folks have done this without social media. How do we make the connection? I think that's a very powerful question. How do we connect across generations? And if anyone can start this for about 2 minutes, here's your platform.
Let me say very briefly, and then I'll shut up for the rest of the show, okay? I believe me and Belinda are about the same age. I'm 64, and so I'm considered, every day I look in the mirror and I say, oh my goodness, I want them to open up so I can go to the hairdresser and dye my
Come on.
I'm starting to look 64, right? You know what I'm saying? You know, and normally every 2 weeks I spend $45 just to get that thing, you know, put a little black in it, right? You know, I remember that joke you told in an AFAM meeting when I said, Doug, you're a little bit, are you older than me? And you said, oh, you're a lot older than me, Frank.
Frank, you gotta answer this question.
Okay. The thing is, resist as a Black person, I would say over the age of 45, 50, resist the temptation for anger management. Resist the temptation to channel young Black people's rage into so-called political, positive projects, okay? Try to treat their iconoclastic, explosive energy and hatred for this country as a symptom of something that should be teaching you, as opposed to something that you should quash and make more manageable so that they can become better citizens.
Okay. Frank, on that note, you'll have the last word. Again, I want to thank our distinguished panel and panelists. I want to thank our team at OIE. And above all, I want to thank all of you for being in community this afternoon, and I hope to see you tomorrow. Have a good day.